Hello, class. This is going to be the last lecture on for this semester on chapter 28. It'll be in two parts. So I'm going to move very quickly and try and do this in as short a time as possible. Okay, first slide. Um, the gay liberation movement began in 1969 at a place called Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village in New York City. Now, the issue with uh, this issue was about homosexuality, and in 1969 and the centuries before that, most places had laws against homosexuality. You didn't have to do anything. If you just were a homosexual, you were illegal and could go to jail. So the problem with that was the police took advantage. I mean, there's a lot of problems with it, I tell you. But the main problem for this situation was that the police took advantage of these people's lack of legal standing and would raid gay bars where homosexuals. It was about the only place in society where gays and lesbians could go and be their real selves in company that they felt safe in and found support and friendship and entertainment and a casual evening. So police used to rouse the gay bars repeatedly all the time because they could. And the patrons of the gay bars couldn't do anything about it because they couldn't complain because it's a gay bar. They would just go to jail for breathing. So one day, the police came in to rouse the Stonewall Inn, which they'd done many, many times over the years before, and the patrons defended themselves. And it turned into a big fight and that fell out onto the street in front of the bar. The neighborhood got involved, and most of the neighborhood were supporters of gay rights, of their gay community. And it just turned into a huge 2-day melee on the news, of course, that night. And the reason this is so significant is because since it captured the national news, since it was in New York City, it educated Americans about the very, very bad treatment of homosexuals in this country. And this was in the atmosphere of the movements of the 60s when so many marginalized minority groups were calling attention publicly to how they had been treated before. The Native Americans, the Chicano movement, the women's rights movement, began with civil rights movement. Of course, they all emulated that and said, "Hey, they're on the path to getting real equality. How about us?" So that's the vein of Stonewall Inn riot was in that same atmosphere or philosophy. And it's still underway, right? We're still trying to reach a point where gays and lesbians are treated without discrimination. And, places like Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby, ultra-conservatives do not treat them fairly. They insist on religious acquiescence to the way those people think. Well, in this country, we have freedom of religion. We have freedom of religion. We have freedom of speech. We have basic human civil rights freedom. So here's the way I interpret the 14th Amendment. It talks about equality. That's the amendment where we gain our civil rights. Okay, specifically spelled out civil rights. Everybody's equal before the law. Here's how I sum it all up. If you can do it, I can do it. Right? That's equality. If you can do it, I can do it. If I can do it, then you can do it. See why gay marriage is unconstitutional? I mean, the laws against gay marriage are unconstitutional. If I can get married and I can pass on my assets when I die to my spouse, if I was married to a man, why can't gays and lesbians do that? Why can't they pass on their assets to their spouse? Why can't they have their spouse covered on their health insurance and life insurance as a marriage partner? Well, they can now, but for years and years, I mean, up until 3 or 4 years ago, that was illegal. homosexuals couldn't marry. But if I can marry and you can marry, then they should be able to marry under the Constitution. This is not a religious issue. We live by the Constitution in this nation, not by the Bible or somebody's interpretation of the Bible. And do you think we would ever be able to agree on a religious philosophy if the United States wanted to adopt one officially? How many churches are there in any given town in America? All those churches exist because people see the Bible differently. They interpret the Bible differently, or they don't go by the Bible at all, which is their prerogative, their choice. So, whose religion are we going to go by, is the question. Anyway, back to the gay rights issue. If everybody is equal under the Constitution, then everybody's equal. The law treats everybody equally. And I think we're going to see this more and more upheld as time goes by because it's a constitutional issue, not a religious issue. Okay. All right, let's move on. Okay, continuing on with the same idea of individual rights and equal under the law, we have the idea of birth control that came before the public's eye in the early 1960s when the pill was invented, 1961. It was illegal when they invented the pill, but 4 years later, the Supreme Court, actually all birth control was illegal up until 1965. Griswold v. Connecticut changed the world in that respect because it was illegal to prevent a woman's body from becoming pregnant. And that was a religious belief that was imposed on society from a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, that said, if God wants a woman to get pregnant, then she should get pregnant. And you can't, if you stop that pregnancy, you're interfering with the will of God. Now, that was before society became what we call today enlightened. And not very many people think that way anymore. So, Griswold v. Connecticut was recognizing those, the different ways of regarding birth control by legalizing birth control, but only for married women. Okay, the fear was that if the pill or other forms of birth control were legalized for all women, that all women would just become sluts. I mean, this is a also very old, ancient, many hundred years idea that women were, how do I want to say this? Impossible. Women found it impossible to control their sexual urges. We don't think this way today, but that back in Puritan times and prior to that, and really up until around the 1920s, there was widely believed this was a widely believed, supposedly truth that women were just oversexed and could not control themselves. And then you throw birth control into the mix so that they don't have to worry about becoming pregnant. And, well, women would just be, the world would just go to hell in a handbasket. So birth control was only legalized for married women in 65. That's going to change over the period of the 60s. I can't remember when the pill became legal for unmarried women, but it's sometimes around the end of the 60s. So in 73, the Supreme Court made another decision called Roe v. Wade, and it was based on the right of a woman to privacy. In other words, the woman, along with her doctor for advisor, can make decisions about her own body without any interference from anybody else. It was solely based on that. If I want to have an abortion, it's my business, it's my body, I'm going to have one. And the government can't tell me I can't because I am sovereign over my own body, right? That was the principle. And it only affected the first trimester of pregnancy. So that's the first 3 months, 3.5 months, or something like that. That's when abortion was legal under Roe v. Wade. And then there's been other Supreme Court decisions and upheld federal court decisions that have expanded that definition. Which anyway, um, now the issue here, the heart of the issue, is how do you know when a human being becomes a human being? What you call a human being, and how do you define human being? That sounds stupid, but look at it this way. Is a fetus an independent being? Can it live on its own outside the mother's body? Can its brain direct its body to function properly? Um, is it fully formed? Does it have a heartbeat? A lot of people think that life begins when the heartbeat starts, which is about 5 weeks or something like that. But um, that's an opinion. The problem with those things is that they're opinions. If you say life begins at conception, that's fine, but that's your opinion. You can't prove that. There's no way to prove it. It's just your belief, your opinion. Now, since we have religious freedom in this country, you can't impose your religious beliefs on me. I have my own religious beliefs that I live by, not yours. So that's the issue. And you might want to phrase it, when does the soul enter the body? Is that at conception? Is that when the heart beats? Is that when the child is born and can live independently of its mother? I mean, technically, a child premature can live like at 7 months. A child could live outside its mother body if it had the proper care from a neonatal facility, right? For preemies. So that's maybe not even a viable human being yet then, if it can't live independent of its mother's body. So these are complex issues. That's what I want you to understand about abortion. It's not black or white. I mean, it may be black or white for some people. You may just say, well, yeah, it's wrong. It's murder. Well, if it's murder, then hundreds of thousands of women down through world history have committed murder. Because making abortion legal or illegal doesn't stop abortions. Abortions were self-performed by women. Um, they were performed by men with no doctoral training, morticians, veterinarians. It was a racket because they could charge a lot of money for an abortion, and chances are the woman who went to those kind of doctors, so-called doctors, are going to die from the abortion because they don't know what they're doing. Self-abortions done by women. Often, this is going to gross you out, but the number one way that women tried to abort a fetus is with knitting needles. Now you can imagine, most of the time that didn't work too well, and they died of internal bleeding. So making abortion illegal is not going to stop it. It's going to result in those back alley abortions that the world has experienced throughout the ages. This is a complex issue, okay? You may not think it's complex. It may not be complex for you, but as a legal idea, it is very complex. And just because you have, or someone has, a strong religious belief about what abortion is or is not, does not mean that their religious belief can be imposed on me or on anybody else, because we have freedom of religion in this country. Okay, I wanted to make sure that everybody was clear on Roe v. Wade. Okay, the next 12 or 13 slides, I think, in this first part are going to be about Vietnam. I'll give you some background. We'll talk a lot about the soldiers that fought in the war, the troops, and then in the second half of the slideshow, we'll talk about the end of it. Okay. So Vietnam is that on the world map there, or the Southeast Asian map there on the right, you can see how small Vietnam is. It's that little black, they call it a curve or a comma, the comma country. It looks like a little comma. It's wider at the top than it is at the bottom, and it's right next to the Philippines. The islands just to the right of Vietnam are the Philippines, and then just south of it is Indonesia. Um, Over here on the left map, you see a closer image of Vietnam with the red line through the middle. That's right about where Vietnam was divided in 1954, that created two different countries, North Vietnam with its government, South Vietnam with its government. So the way this happened was North Vietnam, or the whole country of Vietnam, the whole country of Laos, and the whole country of Cambodia were combined by the French into one colony, one French colony called French Indochina. That happened in the early part of the 20th century, and France had controlled those areas up until the government of France fell in World War II. Then Japan, who was allied with Germany, stepped in and took over French Indochina, occupied it, and of course the Japanese were very, very brutal to their enemies. And pretty much everybody in Southeast Asia, including China and Korea, were very serious enemies of Japan and had been for centuries. So this was a very bad experience for the people in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But they had a strong fighter against the Japanese in Ho Chi Minh, who was a man who rose to leadership from the peasantry in Vietnam, and the people loved him. He fought with us, with the United States, Great Britain, the United Nations, well, not the United Nations, but fought with us on the Allied side of World War II, and expected that for that, at the end of the war, if Japan was defeated, that they would receive independence. Vietnam would get independence, which didn't happen. Because when Japan had to leave at the end of the war because they lost, France wanted Indochina back again as a colony. Well, Vietnam wanted to be independent. They even wrote a Declaration of Independence that was framed, is word for word identical to the United States Declaration of Independence, except for the name of the country. So Ho Chi Minh thought surely they're going to recognize what our desires are if I write it just like their declaration. But no, because do you think the United States is ever going to side with a Southeast Asian nation against France? No. So we backed France. France went to war with the Vietnamese people, and they fought them for 9 years, from 1945 to 1954, when the French troops were defeated. A major battle at a place called Bien Dien Phu. So the world was not, the United States especially, was not going to allow Vietnam to become a communist country. Ho Chi Minh was now communist. So they sit down at the negotiating table and determine that Vietnam should be divided in half like Korea was. That's the best solution, because we can meet our foreign policy goals by not allowing the spread of communism, and we'll have a non-communist nation right there in South Vietnam. So that was what was agreed on at the table. Now, Ho Chi Minh was not in favor of this, but he was outvoted. Generally speaking, the people of Vietnam did not want this. Nobody's asking them, right? This is the same issue that we had in Korea, and the same issue we had in the Philippines and in other places. Nobody asks the people who live there what they would like. Same problem we made with the same mistake we made with the Native Americans, wasn't it? So Vietnam is going to become divided, communist in the north under Ho Chi Minh, non-communist in the south under dictators that are put in office by the CIA. And that's going to go on from 1954 until the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. The CIA is literally running South Vietnam, but they can't do it overtly out in the open. They have to do it covertly from behind the scenes. So they put different dictators as the head guy in South Vietnam, but they keep running into problems because these men never want to do what the CIA tells them to do. So they go through a lot of these men. I mean, they bring them in, they throw them out, they bring them in, throw them out, bring them in, throw them out. They're not democratically elected or anything like that. One of them, the CIA assassinates because he was so corrupt. So it's really a problem. Anyway, that's where we're going to leave it as we begin to move on and go on to the Vietnam War. Okay? In 1960, uh, North Vietnam and South Vietnam then were at war since about 1955, Civil War going on, and it wasn't looking too good for South Vietnam. And the United States had already staked its reputation on maintaining South Vietnam as non-communist, so we're going to send some military advisors. These are like training officers. I mean, they could be combat troops, but you'd have to have a certain expertise in a certain area, and then you could be sent to Vietnam. You're not going to be fighting. These people are not fighting forces. They're teachers. They're advisors. They want to teach the South Vietnamese army. First of all, they want to professionalize it. They want to make it more military, better discipline, more regimentation and routine. They want to give them training on modern weaponry. They want to instill in them military strategy, military philosophy. So they have some weapons besides just guns that they can use to defeat the communist Vietnam, North Vietnam. Well, this was a really, really hard task. It doesn't sound like it's that hard, but remember, our military advisors and trainers that went over there knew nothing about the Vietnamese culture. They couldn't speak the language. They didn't understand the culture. They didn't understand the religious beliefs. They didn't understand the food. I mean, they knew nothing about this. To them, everything that the Vietnamese did was just wrong because they didn't do it like Americans. These people were not very highly skilled in diplomacy when they went to Vietnam. So this is not going to work out too well. We started out with a few thousand advisors, and by 1963 we had 17,000 advisors over there. Nobody's fighting. They're just advising. The South Vietnamese are fighting, of course. So to give you an idea of how difficult this job was, the picture here on the screen is a South Vietnamese army general, and he's assassinating a suspected spy by that young man. The young man had just walked up from the other side of the street. There's a video of this, as well as the still pictures taken from a video. So they don't know him from Adam. They suspect that he might be a spy for the North, and so this general just whips out his pistol and blows the guy's brains out right there on the street in downtown Saigon. Now, they got a little ways to go to become professional, don't they? To use some self-control, to live by the rule of law, innocent until proven guilty. This is a terrible, terrible situation that it's an impossible situation for the American forces. All right. So who the enemy is that we're fighting over there? Well, there's two different enemies that are aligned together. One is the Viet Cong. These are South Vietnamese people who sympathize with the North. They're rice farmers, okay? They are unsophisticated villagers who live like their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. They don't give a rat's ass whether the country is communist or dictator or democracy. They don't care. They just want it reunited so they can see their relatives in the cut off half of Vietnam, and life can go back to the normal that they want. They're not politically savvy. They just aren't invested in the type of government for that country. They're much more concerned with reunification with their relatives, with having the country be one giant whole like they wanted it to be at the end of World War II, and having their rice paddy, their babies, their families. They live in grass huts, no running water, no electricity. They're fine with that. Just leave us alone, let us have our life, right? So that's the Viet Cong. Then the North Vietnamese military, the communist military, is also a big threat. Now, they infiltrate. Now, most of the fighting in Vietnam War takes place in South Vietnam because the North Vietnamese army is constantly infiltrating into South Vietnam. They come in by roads through Laos and Cambodia. They come in by the ocean, by the ports. They come in on foot through the jungle where you can't see them. They come in through tunnels. They built hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of underground tunnels under South Vietnam, not just to travel through, but to also to hide in. When a skirmish broke out in the jungle, the North Vietnamese just melted away into the jungle in these tunnels, and you could not find them. It was very frustrating, very frustrating. I'll talk more about that later. So the biggest problem for our troops, aside from combat, was who do you trust? How do you know who's an enemy and who's a friend? These people all look alike. They sound alike. They dress alike. They talk alike. They eat the same foods. They are identical. There's no cultural differences between North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese. So how do you tell who's a South Vietnamese spy or aligned their allegiances with the North and who's actually a supporter of the American military? Well, you can't tell that. You can see how that's going to make you crazy. One of the worst situations that our soldiers got involved in, and all our military people, on their bases and posts, Army Post, Air Force Base, was orphan children. There were thousands and thousands of orphan children in South Vietnam whose parents had been killed or their village had been destroyed, and they didn't have anyone to care for them. They were just loose on the world. So a lot of times our soldiers would befriend these little kids, and they'd give them candy and stuff like that, and they'd invite them onto the base, and they'd be in their barracks or their tent with them for a while and just kind of be friends. Maybe the little kid would shine your shoes or make your bunk or something, and you'd flip him a quarter for it. They had a bond. It was very, very common. And then one day, you see this little kid coming over the crest of a defensive battery, walking towards the gate of the post, and he's got a vest on that's full of dynamite. You can see it. And he's your little friend that's been shining your shoes. And the guard at the gate says, is caught in this decision of, do I let the kid come onto the post and blow us all up, or do I kill this 7-year-old boy? Now, how would you like to make that decision? You're not going to be able to live with it either way. I don't care how hard you are, how cold your exterior is. You kill a 7-year-old boy and watch him explode into bits and pieces and vapor, you're never going to get over that. So this was very, very difficult for our soldiers, and these things happened, periodically. So you'd lay down your bunk at night and it'd explode, and because there was a grenade underneath you, put there by the little boy that you'd befriended. It was an awful situation for our troops. All right, the way we're going to actually ramp up the war is with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin is that bay, you see it on the map, it's that hook part up there just off of Hanoi in North Vietnam. It's in red, Gulf of Tonkin. We had a Navy spy ship up there, and that's a picture of it there, the USS Maddox, watching the North Vietnamese, and especially watching the coast. And one day, the Maddox was fired on with a torpedo. It didn't hit, missed it. But they radioed, back in that they'd been fired on by the North Vietnamese, and they were told to just wait. Don't respond, just stand down and wait and see what happens. Well, nothing happened. So, rocked on a few days, and then they reported being fired on again. And almost immediately, they called back and said, no, we weren't fired on. That second, it wasn't a torpedo this time. It was the sonar operator made a mistake. He saw a blip and he thought it was a torpedo. It wasn't, so false alarm. But when Johnson found out about this scenario, he did not allow the second time the Maddox was fired on, the retraction, he didn't allow that to go to the press. He allowed the press to report that the Maddox had been fired on twice. And then he took that information to Congress. He addressed a joint session of the House of Representatives and the Senate at the same time. And he said, you know, you guys have got to give me, no, let me qualify that. He spoke to the Senate. He went and spoke to the Senate because the Senate has the constitutional right to declare war. That's where declaration of war come from, is from the Senate. So Johnson couldn't do it on his own. So he went to the Senate and he said, you've got to give me war powers so I can defend American troops wherever they are in the world anytime some yahoo decides to shoot at them. And Congress said, you bet, you've got it. You take the war powers and do something, do what you want to with it. We're out of here. Well, first of all, it's unconstitutional. Without a constitutional amendment, they really couldn't do that legally, but they did. So the reason that's so important is because Johnson was not a military man. He'd never been in the military, didn't fight in World War II, and now he's in charge of the Vietnam War. He relied on his generals, mainly William Westmoreland, to advise him, but Westmoreland was a very bad advisor. He'd fought in World War II, but he didn't know anything about jungle warfare. He didn't know anything about the culture of Southeast Asia, those countries in there. Johnson couldn't make those decisions on his own because he had no training and no experience. So it became a real nightmare for the nation because of this War Powers Act that is giving the president control. So let's move on to the next slide here. The weapons we're going to be using in Vietnam are massive, not nuclear weapons. We could have, but and oftentimes while I'm talking about that, you'll hear older men that were served in Vietnam maybe say, you know, the reason we couldn't win in Vietnam is because we fought with one arm tied behind our back. We could have just thrown everything we had at North Vietnam and wiped them off the face of the earth. Well, that may be true. Like General MacArthur wanted to nuke Red China during the Korean War and end the problem with that enemy. And I think a lot of those soldiers from Vietnam that feel frustrated that they were not able to be as brutal as they would have liked to be, or as militant as they would have liked to be, don't understand that concept. The reason we couldn't throw more into the Vietnam War was because Russia and China were both standing behind their communist ally in North Vietnam. Now, if we couldn't push that envelope very far, because both of those countries, after 1965, both those countries have the bomb. Russia after 1949, and China in the 1960s. So we're playing with fire here. There's no way we could have escalated this war any farther and maintained the safety of the United States. Okay, moving on. The bombs. Dynamite bombs was the #1 weapon used there, and this began with an operation that Johnson called Rolling Thunder, Operation Rolling Thunder. Right after the War Powers Act was given to the president, he planned this bombing. It's what George Bush called shock and awe. We're going to go in with air power and just bomb them into smithereens. I mean, there won't be anything left of them. And then we'll just have to send the boots on the ground to go in and do what we call a mop-up campaign, and the war will be over. Well, it sounds logical. It sounds like it would be a good idea, but the fact is it's never worked. We've tried it on multiple occasions since since airplanes have been invented, and it's never worked. Never gotten us really anywhere. In this case, it was the same situation. Between 1965 and 73, we dropped 3 times as many dynamite bombs on North Vietnam as were dropped in the entire world during World War II. Now, North Vietnam's about the size of the Texas Panhandle from Midland north. So it's not a very big area to drop that many bombs on. And it just blows your mind to think that the North Vietnamese survived that. But they did, because they had learned to live underground. They moved whole cities underground and withstood that bombing. And when the bombing ended, they came out and were ready for a fight. And so here we go. We also are going to use incendiary bombs. Incendiary means fire. They're going to explode in fire. Napalm was probably the most widely used incendiary bomb. And napalm is like jelly. It's like if you took a jar of grape jelly and threw it at the wall, it would stick. A lot of places where the jelly landed would stick to the wall because it's sticky. Napalm is like that. But every place it hits, it bursts into flame. Doesn't matter what it hits. If it hits a human being, if it hits a house, if it hits a business, if it's a car, if it's an animal, it bursts into flame. So it's massively dangerous. Dropped that from planes and fired it from helicopters. Gasoline, incendiary. We started fires with gasoline, started fires with propane. And then we used a lot of defoliants. Defoliant is the term came to be called Agent Orange. It was called Agent Orange because it came in orange barrels when they first started sending it over, but it wasn't always an orange barrel. Sometimes it was green or blue or different color. It didn't matter. Anyway, it always was called Agent Orange after the orange barrels. So defoliants tear the leaves off the trees. They kill the leaves, right? Which eventually kills the tree also. So this is heavy jungle there in Vietnam. You know, it rains 6 months out of the year, and the other 6 months is 99% humidity. So it's very lush, very thick, very heavy undergrowth, underbrush. And some of these plants are huge, like an elephant ear. You've seen elephant ears around here in the summertime. They're 5 times the size of that elephant ear, and you could hide a whole troop of soldiers behind them. Maybe that's exaggerating a little bit, but you see what I mean. The jungle was dangerous, dangerous. So we're going to try and get rid of the jungle by using Agent Orange, and it's very successful. The pictures here on the right, the top picture is a napalm bombing. You see how napalm explodes into fireballs, and then of course everything that it touches is burning also. So huge conflagrations in napalm, and the use of napalm. And these children running down the street are running towards American troops. Their village has just been napalm bombed, and the little girl there that doesn't have any clothes on, her back, her clothes had caught on fire and were melted into her back, into the skin on her back. It's a miracle that little girl even made it to the troops there on the outside of town. But they grabbed her and wrapped her in wet blankets and put her on a helicopter and evacuated her out to Tokyo, to the American air base there, and treated her, and she lived. This photograph was so evocative. It evokes emotion that it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1972. Now, this lady is that little girl. She lives in Toronto. She's had almost 20 surgeries now to fix the burn scars on her back and the back of her legs. But she's had a successful, somewhat happy life after she got out of Vietnam. All right, who the soldiers were. Well, as you can see by this slide, the vast majority of the soldiers were working class or poor, and that's true today, the same as it's been for every war down through history. It's the people who don't have privilege, the people who don't have influence that fight the wars. The people who have influence send them. So Vietnam was no different in that sense, but there were some problems with this that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So if most of the people fighting come from the lower economic levels, then you can also bet that most of the people who die are from those same economic levels. Average age of a soldier in Vietnam was 19. Now that shows you how the massive numbers of 18, 19, 20-year-olds that there were. This was a young man's war. There were not very many older people, I mean, even late 20s, that served in Vietnam, unless they were left over from the Korean War. We instituted the draft during Vietnam, and so virtually everybody that fights in that war are new recruits, not military career guys, right? They've just gone into the war on the spur of the moment, or they were drafted, so they're not really military minded, right? They don't have careers in the military. All right. You could get a deferment if you stayed in college. Now, that was a pretty big deal. Uh, Back then, there was a lot of pressure from society uh, for young people to go to college because the United States needed well-educated people for in the field, especially of science and math, just like today. But we also were a growing nation, right? The population's doubled in my lifetime. So we need more school teachers, we need more doctors, we need more of everything. And these are professionals, professionally trained, so you wanted to go to college. So there was a kind of a reward for going to college. You could get out of the draft. But the other thing is, you're going to graduate in 4 years, and the war's not over yet. Then what do you do? Well, you go back to school again for a more advanced degree. Instead of just a bachelor's, now you go for your master's. You might go for 2 masters, and then you might go for your PhD. This is what we call a perpetual student. That's when the term came out during the Vietnam War, because if you could afford it, now of course this is going to be, financial aid wasn't as widely available as it is today, and there weren't any grants. So if you could afford it, you could stay in college and avoid the draft. If you were the sole support of a family, you could avoid the draft. Now, by that I mean you had to be the breadwinner, the man who was the breadwinner in that family. In other words, no older male, or everybody in the family was dependent on you. So let me ask you this. How many babies do you think were born and marriages happened to keep the boyfriend from being drafted? A lot, a lot. A lot of young girls got pregnant and then married her boyfriend to keep him out of the draft. Um, it was fairly common. It was just one of the things that you did. Why go to Canada when you can just marry your girlfriend and get her pregnant, and then boom, you're out of the draft. So it was a go-to solution for a lot of young couples. If you had certain medical issues, you can't be drafted. One of them is, well, I knew a guy who shot one of his toes off. um, because you can't march if you don't have all your toes. Your toes give you balance. So, yeah, if you're missing a toe, they won't draft you. And, stuff like that. I mean, that was pretty extreme to shoot yourself. But if you could get a doctor to say you had a medical condition, and of course, influential people run in the circles with doctors. And so it was not uncommon for doctors to write draft board letters to get certain young men out of the draft. And the whole thing be a fraud. That was the trouble with the draft, at least early on. After 1969 and they adopted the lottery, it was a little bit better, but draft boards were very corrupt. Oh, moving on. So once you're in country, these are the things you're going to be seeing a lot of is helicopters. They call them Jolly Green Giants. The Jolly Green Giant. It's going to take you to the place of deployment where you're going to carry out your search and destroy mission. It's going to come and get you. It's going to drop you into a hot zone where they're firing, and it's going to come to evacuate you out if you're injured, like that lower right picture's doing. Helicopters were everywhere in Vietnam, and a helicopter gunner, the guy who's standing there in the open door with his machine gun, was the shortest lived position in the United States Army. In other words, if you were a door gunner on a helicopter, chances of coming back home from Vietnam were not very high. Very, very dangerous because you don't have any protection against enemy fire, and helicopters fly very low, especially when they're coming in to pick somebody up or drop people off. So that was very dangerous. But you're always glad to see the Jolly Green Giant coming. Now, I mentioned search and destroy missions, and this is what the majority of Army troops did in Vietnam. Um, General Westmoreland was out of ideas pretty much by 1960, the middle of 1968. And so the war became what's called a war of attrition, Attrition. Attrition. It means kill all of them, and if you're the last man standing, you win. In other words, if you can kill enough of the enemy, they'll run out of people to replace those dead guys pretty soon, and then we'll win. And that's what the Vietnam War was about. Um, Generally speaking, it was not about seizing territory and holding it. They tried doing that, but it was impossible. They could not hold it. They could not hold it because the North Vietnamese kept coming, kept coming, kept coming. Well armed from Russia and from China, well supplied, well armed, well fed. They just kept at it, kept at it, kept at it. They were motivated, right? It's very difficult to beat a nation in their own country. Uh, Beat them on their own homeland, that's hard to do. Very hard to do. Because they have, it's like home court advantage if you're in basketball. They have the emotional will to defend their territory. And that was a big part of the problem in Vietnam. So this is how search and destroy missions worked. You have your army post over here on the left, and that's your post where you're stationed. It could have been Da Nang Air Force Base, or I'm more familiar with the Air Force, but anyway, that's your permanent station. And every 2 weeks, your CO sends you out on a search and destroy mission. And this is how it goes. You go out on a search and destroy mission. Out here to this pink area there is a search and destroy area. It might be 10 miles wide. It might be 25 miles wide. Doesn't matter. You've got to search out the enemy in there, and so you prowl that whole area around and around and around, looking for the enemy, looking for the enemy. When you find him, you engage, kill as many of them as you can, and then you can go on and continue to look for more. And then you've got this little bush camp out here in the jungle where you sleep, pretty much out in the open. You cook over a little fire, or you eat meals ready to eat or something like that. So K rations, I think they had. They didn't have meals ready to eat then, I don't think. So that's your search and destroy mission. And then you're out there in the bush for 2 weeks, and then you go back to your base, to your post, and you have 2 weeks off. And then at the end of that 2 weeks, you come back out here and do another search and destroy mission. And you're always looking. The goal here is to look for the enemy and kill him when you find him. Don't take him captive. Don't hold the ground. Once you've taken a position, you don't have to hold it. Just kill everybody and then move on. And you do that for 2 weeks. Then you go back to your post again, and you have 2 weeks to rest. And then at the end of that time, you come out and do another search and destroy mission, 2 weeks, and then you go back to your post, and then you come back and do another search. Do you see how frustrating this could be? I mean, what's the point here? Why are your comrades, the soldiers next to you, sacrificing their life for this? Why are you putting your life on the line for this? There's no point to it other than to kill, to kill, to kill, to kill. You think that was hard on those men? Do you think that they came home with psychological problems because of this? Do you think they developed drug dependency, alcohol dependency while they're over there in country? Yes, they did. Yes, they did, because this is an impossible situation to live with. And you're there for a year. When you're drafted, you're there for 12 months. And if you want to, you can what they call re-up or re-enlist for another 6 months, and you get a giant bonus. Enough cash to buy a brand new car. Most expensive car out there, you could buy it with your bonus for re-signing. And then you could do that as many times as you wanted to till you got killed. Literally. You could do that over and over again and stay in country and make all that money. And it's always the name of the game in capitalism. So a lot of guys did that. And then by the time they come home, they can't function anymore. Their mind has just been so warped by this frustrating situation. Uh, they've created an alternate reality for themselves over there. So one of the problems with this kind of warfare also is in the jungle. So you're out there on your search and destroy mission, and the enemy could be hiding right just 3 feet away from you, and you don't know it because the jungle is too thick. You can't see them. They had one of the ways that they took out a lot of our men on search and destroy was by sniper fire. And you can't see where the sniper is. You're sitting ducks there walking down the path. They also booby trapped the jungle. They put little tiny claymore mines. They called them bouncing betties, and embedded them in the trail. These trails were like animal trails through the jungle. Just narrow one person at a time walk down them. And you'd step on this little landmine, you'd hear it click, and there's no way you can get out of that situation. When you lift your foot up, the claymore mine it's on a spring, it's going to bounce up, and right about your waist, it's going to explode. And if the guy in front of you is too close, it's going to break his back and it's going to tear your guts out. So 2 for 1. That was probably the most common booby trap, the claymore mine. They also would put pits. They dig pits with upright spikes. I know you've seen this in movies and stuff, and you think, oh, they didn't really do that. But yeah, they did. And you could fall in there and kill yourself. They'd put tripwires across the path, and it would shoot a spear, or shoot an arrow, or shoot a rifle. um, it was terrifying. It was terrifying. You didn't have a choice. You had to go out on search and destroy missions, or you'd be put in jail for disobeying orders. And if you went out there, chances of getting killed or maimed were very high. And if you didn't get killed or maimed, it was hard to come out of it with your mind intact, right? Your emotional state where you were coherent. So that's what the men did in Vietnam. That was the purpose, and that was the activity. All right. So the draft is going to begin by lottery in 1969. Before that, it was the draft board, and draft boards were local by county or small town, and the people who sat on the draft board were the movers and shakers from that county. The sheriff, the judge, the guy who owns the big furniture store, those people. And I can guarantee you, their kids are not going to be drafted because they decide who gets drafted. So it was very corrupt. It was a very corrupt system. Um, they could, you know, give anybody. This is where we came in with the fraudulent letters from the doctor and things like that. And the whole draft board there may realize this is just fraud, but they do it. They follow it anyway because the kid's dad is his best friend. So it was very, very um, not equal at all. Very corrupt. So in 1969, they tried to make it more fair by going to a lottery system. And they would draw, it wasn't just one date, they drew 2 or 3, maybe 6 or 7 dates once a year on January 1st. They draw the birthdays. And if one of those dates was your birthday, you were drafted. So it really was. They pulled the number out of a hopper like if you're playing bingo or something. So it was an attempt at fairness. I don't know exactly how fair it was, but seemed like it was better than the draft board situation. The problem in Vietnam with fighting with the troops was that they were drafted and were sent to Vietnam, but they could not vote for the elected officials that were sending them to Vietnam. That was a big motivation behind the anti-war movement. And that the voting age was 21 until 1971. And because of the anti-war movement that continually pointed this out, we're going to war, getting killed for you guys, and we can't even vote. We're not even, full citizens of the United States here. That Congress finally changed that law in 1971. had no diplomatic relationship with North Vietnam. Um, we barely got away with the lives of our diplomats from the American embassy before the country collapsed, and we couldn't do anything about that. We didn't have any um, communication with them at all. Unknown civilian deaths in Vietnam. Our estimate is around 50 million. Communist estimates is about 2 million. Ours is 50,000. Theirs is 2 million. So somewhere in between those two numbers is the number of civilian deaths. Now, this is an annual death rate in Vietnam, and this is important to understand because it puts Vietnam in a completely different category from the wars in the Middle East. Okay, started out in April 1966. There were 245 deaths in that 1 month, and 3,000 for the year. But look at the 2 years later, from 66 to 68. The monthly death toll over doubles, and the annual death toll doubles. So this is massive death for Americans, for us, for the home crowd watching this happen. Everybody knew someone who died in Vietnam. Everybody knew someone who died in Vietnam. Um, it's not just an abstract concept like the war in Afghanistan and Iraq really is to a lot of Americans, to most Americans. If you don't live near a military installation, it's not on your radar unless you have a family member serving, and there's not that many serving anymore, especially now. Um, uh, American families, it was just affecting everyone. Not as bad as World War II did, but it's still very, very prominent on everybody's minds, and it's on the news every night. It's the first war where you actually got filmed footage on the nightly news from the day before in Vietnam. You might even recognize your family member in the videos. I mean, they did a remarkable job. The journalists did a remarkable job of capturing this war every day as it happened on film. That's not allowed today because the administrations have not allowed any journalists over there into the war zone without an escort, so they control everything. I mean, there is no free speech when it comes to these wars in the Middle East. American public are not informed at all like we were during Vietnam. So there's a little comparison down there at the bottom. In the whole 12 years, or however many, it's been longer than that now, since 2003, 17 years we've been fighting in the Middle East. It's the longest war in American history. 6,845 American troops have died. Now, that's way too many. But compare that with Vietnam. That was almost an annual event in Vietnam. Now we're talking about 17 years. So there's really no comparison here. The number of troops in country, the number of fighting forces, the number of American families that are directly involved with Afghanistan and Iraq, I guarantee you, if we had the same number of troops in fighting and the same number of deaths today that we had during Vietnam, Americans would be in the street, just like they were in the 1960s. I don't think that the American people would stand for that, for sure. Now, the thing about the death toll in Iraq and Afghanistan, not the death toll, but the rate of injuries. Look at that on that next line. Over 1 million participants, military participants from America, have been injured. 1 million. A lot of those people are maimed for life. I think the figure is very high, something like 40% of injuries from Iraq and Afghanistan are people that are maimed for life, meaning that they've lost a hand, they've lost a lower arm, upper arm, the shoulder blade has been blown out, they've lost a leg, they've lost an eye, half their skull is gone. Terrible, terrible injuries that never have existed in the world before. You know why? Because we couldn't keep those people alive in other wars. In Vietnam, if you had an arm blown off in Vietnam, you're probably going to die. We didn't have that good of battlefield medicine at that time. They didn't have that good of medicine in the hospital at that time. Wasn't any transplanting or anything like that. I mean, you'd bleed out before you even got to the hospital, even the field hospital. Uh, but in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saved those people. We save people that have had half their skull blown off. I mean, maybe not quite. That's a little exaggerated, but you know what I mean. People with serious brain injuries that would not have ever lived in another war now come home and are expected to, pick up and go on. And that's on us. If the Veterans Administration does not have the money or the facilities to treat those people and take care of them for the rest of their life if they need it, that's on us. That's on us. I just can't make this any stronger. Um, I don't want to go and fight in that war, right? So they're there in our place, and we owe them for that. I really get pissed off when I see signs around town say, "We support the troops, we support the troops," and you go in and talk to the guy, and all he's got is negative things to say about the government and how he hates paying taxes. Well, let me tell you something. The taxes you pay go to support those troops. We just have to remember them. Okay, moving on. PTSD. A lot of troops in Vietnam are going to come home with PTSD. We didn't know what to call it. I mean, they called it shell shock or battle fatigue from World War I and II, but they're going to be different. They're not going to function the way they did before they went to war because war changes people. You're not going to be the same person when you come back as you were before you left. It's just not possible. The human mind responds to every experience in some way. So you're going to carry those experiences with you forever. And that's kind of what PTSD is. This is extreme trauma, right? And it's not just soldiers that experience PTSD, children that witness violence, whether it's domestic violence in the home or whatever, um, they carry that with them the rest of their life. This is how we wind up. A lot of people wind up in prison because they have had such close experiences with violence that violence to them is normal. Of course, violence is not acceptable in society. So any kind of trauma changes you. Witnessing trauma or experiencing trauma, either way, changes. So PTSD is something that comes home with these men, and today women also. And it doesn't matter if it could take years for these symptoms of post-traumatic stress to come out in their life, but it probably is going to come out if they don't deal with it. Now, counseling and drugs, sometimes medications, can minimize the effects of PTSD so you don't continue to go back and relive those experiences and lose sight of the reality that you're in at the time, right? You're not in a war zone anymore, so you can't respond like when you were in the war zone. But look at the effects of PTSD on society. This is something that is sociologists study this, and it's very important to understanding the world we live in. High divorce rate, high suicide rate. That is a major problem for especially the Army in the Middle Eastern, the soldiers that have come back from the Middle East. Suicide rate is higher than it's ever been in the United States Army, and the Army is not doing a good job of addressing it or helping these folks out. Poor parenting skills. Poor employment record. I used to work with a man who had PTSD from Vietnam when I lived out in Portland, Oregon, and I'm telling you, that was a bizarre experience working for someone whose mind was not right. Very nervous guy, serious anxiety, made the stupidest decisions about work I've ever, of anybody I ever worked with. It was bad. But he kept getting promoted because the owners of the company felt sorry for him because he had PTSD from Vietnam. That wasn't a good solution either. About 50% of the soldiers that fought in Vietnam came home either drug or alcohol dependent. Even though drugs and alcohol were illegal in the military on base or on the post. It didn't mean you couldn't get a pass to go to town and, go to some dive bar there in town. and, uh, and of course, they overlooked a lot of the alcohol and drugs even on the post and on the base because the soldiers needed that to cope. They're going to lose their mind uh, if they don't have some escape. That's what drugs and alcohol are. They're escape mechanisms, so you don't have to deal with what's in front of you. That was a big problem in the United States up until around the mid 1990s, when most of these men that came back badly addicted had died by then, um, or were homeless and died from exposure and different things. I mean, drug and alcohol dependence leads to all kinds of other problems. And then homelessness. Homelessness for Vietnam vets is pretty much a non-issue now because they've all died that were in that bad of shape. But for Iraq and Afghanistan fighting forces, there's a huge homelessness problem. Come back with PTSD, you're traumatized, and all of a sudden you can't stand to be inside a building where there's walls. You have to be outside all the time. You can't. That's why people don't live in homes, because they can't tolerate it emotionally. Um, is there help for that? Absolutely. There's all kinds of help for it, but you have to want the help. It's not gonna. Somebody can't come in and impose their help on you. You have to agree. So that's part of the problem. All right.